to Time Between Times storytelling with me, Owen Staton. Welcome to that place where tales are traditionally told. Welcome to that fireside deep in the heart of the forest. Welcome to the place where your mind can rid itself of worries, cares, strife. Welcome to the Time Between Times. I hope you're enjoying these videos. Yesterday, the podcast version had 1,000 downloads. It has gone from strength to strength. So please, if you are enjoying the tales, please check out the podcast. The tales are longer, and you don't have to see my face or these curtains. But welcome, here we are. I hope you've had a good week. The world is still a dark place, but I look outside. I feel a chill in the air. The nights are getting colder, crispier, darker, and the time between times is getting longer. A time for stories. So, sit back, relax, clear your mind, and step into the world of stories for just a little time. Walk down the winding woodland pathway into the time between times. There on the fireplace, there where the fire spits and burns, all our friends are gathered. We look up and see that it's neither night nor day, but the sun has gone and the sky is grey. The veil between our world and the fairy world grows wafer thin. So thin that for just a few moments we can reach into their realm, and for a few moments they can reach into ours. Now is the time that people see lights in the sky. Now is the time that out of the corner of your eye the Tylwyth Teg will suddenly move. And now is the time of ghosts. So take a breath and come with me back in time, almost 200 years, to the small village of Llantiseilo. And there, next to the river, living in a hut, was a lady called Sian Morris. Sian was 40 years old, had lived in the hut by the river for many years. She was a regular at the church and worked as a weaver for the local squire, Mr. Simon, a kindly man who looked after the people of the village and let them gather in his hall, Llantiseilo Hall. One night, all around the village the sky was blotted out by a snowstorm that would be remembered for years. The snow fell so thickly that you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Sian looked out of the windows and knew it was time to go to bed, time to leave this day behind, time to enter the land of dreams, time to hope that the dawn would come and the snow would go. She tucked in her bed, the great woolen blankets over her, and even though outside was almost silent and was as white as a sheet, she slowly went to sleep. It was the middle of the night, and something caused her to wake. Her eyes shot open. She could feel the hair on the back of her head start to stick up. And there, at the foot of her bed, was an apparition, a spirit. It was tall, it was white. It was of her time, but not. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes it was a woman, and sometimes it was just a shape. But something about it made Sian think it was kindly. Something about it made Sian think that she was safe. She sat up in the bed, and the spirit beckoned her to follow. She left the house, using only her bedclothes, just small boots on her feet. She walked into the cold and the snow. Even though the spirit was white could still be seen, glowing in this darkest night. And it took her on a pathway to the church in Llantiseilo, through the streets silent as the grave, until she came to the graveyard, which was quiet as still. Rickety crosses and old stone graves all made their way up towards the great church, which was always filled with laughter, joyous ceremonies, and everyone being together. The spirit looked at Sian, and then, as they looked up at the church, amazingly, even though it was the dead of night, they could see that inside candles were flickering, and the noise of chatter could be heard. The spirit beckoned for Sian to make her way round to the front door, and with a push, the great oak door opened. Sian's cold feet clambered on the stone flagstones as she went inside, and she and the spirit stood at the back of the church, which was crammed with people, at a funeral. Sian was surprised. Why were people holding a funeral in the middle of the night? She turned to the spirit, but the spirit just put a finger to its lips. Shh, it said. It soon became apparent that this was a funeral for Mr. Simon the squire, even though Sian knew well he had not died. She listened as eulogies were said of his good deeds, as hymns were sung, and people openly wept in the congregation. The church was filled with song and sorrow, and the spirit and Sian stood at the back. Suddenly, just as she seemed lost in the revelry of what was happening, the doors to the church blew open with a wind, and the snow rushed in. Sian turned around, and when she turned back, the church was dark and empty, and of the spirit there was only a voice which spoke. Mr. Simon will die, and a stranger will take his hall. This is knowledge I give to you. Sian suddenly felt very, very cold. She turned and walked from the church, back to her home, following her footsteps in the snow. She returned to her bed, and in the morning made her way back to the church, where now the people of the village were starting to gather. She told them of what had happened the night before, and they all laughed, but said, "Say nothing to the squire, for this could be bad. A bad dream is a bad dream, Sian." She sat in a pew near the front as the service was about to begin, when suddenly, through the door at the back, in walked Mr. Simon, the squire of Llantiseilo. He walked down the aisle, nodding greetings to everyone within, until he came to Sian, looked at her as if he was just about to say something, but then turned and went to his seat at the front. The service was joyful. The service was filled with happiness. And at the end, the final hymn was sung and the people stood to leave. But Mr. Simon sat in his seat. Somebody tapped him on the shoulder, and he slumped forward, his head hitting the pew in front of him. He was dead. Although this strangeness, this coincidence had happened, people started to look at Sian in a different way. And a week later, at the time of his funeral, they all gathered at the great hall in Llantiseilo as his coffin was brought out. Sian looked around. She recognised everyone here except one person, dressed in black, with a cane with a wolf's head, jet black hair, and deep-set eyes. They walked up to the church, and the funeral was had. Many people wept, and Sian looked around, for there was no sign of the stranger. After the service, when Mr. Simon was placed under the flagstones in the church, they returned to the hall to make merry and remember his life. But the door was bolted and locked against them. The villagers hammered on the door, and soon after it was opened, and the stranger from earlier was within. He introduced himself as Robin V, and said that he had been left the hall by Mr. Simon, and if anyone could prove otherwise, he would gladly leave. But until that point, he was to remain. The villagers gathered together. There was no sign of a will. Nobody knew where Mr. Simon's wealth had been left. He had no children. He had no wife. They all chatted, for Robin V had asked them to leave and told them not to return to the hall. No longer would be the villagers allowed to gather there. Days passed. The village became a darker place to live, and Robin V turned into a cruel man, with none of the charm of Mr. Simon. One night, when the snow fell again, Sian awoke in the dead of night to find the spirit sitting at the bottom of her bed, taking the form of a woman with long hair, flowers. She beckoned for Sian to follow her once more into the snow. Halfway there, she changed to a man in a long frock coat and opened the door of the church. This time it was all in darkness. This time there was no service. And it pointed to the flagstone where Mr. Simon was buried. Sian looked down. There was a small gap where the stone had yet to settle, and she reached under it and, using all her strength, picked up the flagstone to see fresh earth underneath. She looked into the eyes of the spirit, which nodded. Sian started to dig with her hands. The fresh mud caked under her nails, till she dug down and felt the wood of the coffin. As the hours passed, she managed to clear it. And then, summoning courage, she opened the coffin and looked inside. And there lay Mr. Simon, in his best clothes. His flesh was starting to rot away. His hair was starting to fall out. His eyes were closed and covered with coin. But sticking out from his coat, there was a paper. Sian reached in, and just as her hand was about to touch the paper, a hand reached out of the coffin and grabbed her. The grip of the dead, Mr. Simon's hand grabbed hold of hers. And then with his other hand, and without opening his eyes, he reached inside his own coat and placed the paper in Sian's hand. She let go, stood up. The paper was a will, and the paper explained that Llantiseilo Hall had been left to the people of the village, and there was no sign of Robin V in any of the papers. She covered the coffin, placed the flagstone back, turned around, and the spirit had vanished once more. She made her way back through the cold night until she came to her home, back to bed. And the next day at the church, she showed the villagers the will that she had found. En masse, they made their way down to the hall and hammered on the door. Robin V opened and once again tried to get them to leave. But this time, they dragged him out, threw him into the yard, and told him not to come back, for the hall once again belonged to the villagers. All through her life, Sian and all the villagers of Llantiseilo made good use of that hall in the winter, in the summer, in the spring. But on the nights when the snow did fall, Sian would always remember when the spirit came to see her. Many years have passed since that tale happened. Many years have passed since the spirit showed itself to Sian Morris. But now, when the snow falls like a blanket and the ground is covered white and crisp, this strange spirit is often seen wandering up and down, leaving no footprints. Sometimes it is female, sometimes it's male. Sometimes it stops to speak, and other times it remains silent. It is a keeper of secrets, an imparter of knowledge, and the spirit of the village of Llantiseilo. That, my friends, is the strange story of the stranger at the hall. Thank you very much for listening. As I said before, please have a look at the podcast or have a listen to the podcast. Please like, please subscribe. If you know anyone who likes stories and you think they would like these videos, please pass them on. Please subscribe. Also, I have a Ko-fi channel, Coffee. I will put the link below. If anyone likes to buy me a coffee, it would be most appreciated. Halloween is just around the corner, and I am going to put some gifts out for you. So keep an eye on this channel and keep an eye on the podcast, because there may be some special things coming. Diolch yn fawr am gwrando. Thank you very, very much for listening. Take care. Remember, there is always a welcome for you at the time between times. Diolch yn fawr. Bye.